Sarah Martinez had always been the quiet one in the room. At 32, she worked as a communications specialist for a humanitarian organization, spending her days coordinating supply drops and medical aid in conflict zones from the safety of her desk. Her colleagues often joked that she was just a civilian among their team of former military personnel and seasoned field operatives. Sarah would smile politely, but inside she carried a secret that none of them knew. Growing up in a military family, Sarah had watched her father prepare for deployments to dangerous places around the world. She had begged him to teach her survival skills, combat tactics, and emergency medical procedures. What started as a daughter's curiosity became an obsession. While other teenagers were learning to drive, Sarah was learning to navigate by the stars. While they were at parties, she was practicing first aid on mannequins in her garage. Her father, Colonel James Martinez, had initially resisted teaching his daughter such skills. But Sarah's determination wore him down and he began training her in secret. By the time she turned 18, Sarah could handle weapons, perform battlefield medicine, and survive in hostile environments better than many soldiers. Yet she chose a different path, believing she could make a difference through humanitarian work rather than military service. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now worked alongside people who constantly reminded her of her civilian status. Marcus Thompson, the team's security chief and former Navy SEAL, was particularly vocal about keeping non-combatants away from dangerous situations. Jennifer Walsh, their field coordinator who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, often excluded Sarah from operational briefings, claiming they were too intense for someone without military experience. Sarah never corrected them. She never mentioned the countless hours she had spent training with her father, or the advanced courses she had taken in tactical medicine and crisis management. She figured her job was to support them from behind the scenes, ensuring they had everything they needed to save lives in the field. That approach had worked well for 3 years, until the morning everything changed. The call came in at dawn. Their team had been deployed to evacuate a group of doctors and nurses from a field hospital in a war-torn region where fighting had suddenly escalated. What was supposed to be a routine extraction had gone terribly wrong. The team's helicopter had been forced down by enemy fire, leaving Marcus, Jennifer, and 2 other operatives stranded behind enemy lines with wounded civilians. Sarah sat in the command center, listening to the crackling radio communications as her teammates reported their situation. They were pinned down in the damaged hospital, surrounded by hostile forces with limited ammunition and no clear escape route. The wounded civilians couldn't be moved without proper medical equipment, and their extraction helicopter wouldn't arrive for another 6 hours. As she listened to the desperation in Marcus's voice, something inside Sarah shifted. These weren't just her colleagues anymore. They were her friends, her chosen family, and they were going to die if someone didn't act quickly. The regional commander had already declared the situation too dangerous for a rescue mission. Standard protocol was to wait for the situation to stabilize, but Sarah knew that by then it would be too late. She looked around the command center at the other staff members, all of whom seemed resigned to the fact that they could only wait and hope. Sarah realized that everyone was thinking the same thing she had heard so many times before. She was just a civilian. She wasn't supposed to be the one who could fix this. But as she stared at the tactical map showing her team's location, Sarah Martinez began to plan something that would shock everyone who thought they knew her. Sarah slipped away from the command center while everyone was focused on the radio communications. Her heart pounded as she made her way to the equipment storage facility, but her hands remained steady. Years of training with her father had taught her to channel adrenaline into focus rather than panic. She moved through the corridors with purpose, knowing exactly what she needed and where to find it. The supply warehouse contained everything necessary for field operations. Sarah quickly gathered tactical gear, medical supplies, and communication equipment. She selected a lightweight bulletproof vest, night vision goggles, and a field medic kit that contained enough supplies to treat multiple casualties. Most importantly, she found the keys to one of the organization's all-terrain vehicles, a modified truck designed to navigate the rough terrain surrounding the conflict zone. As she loaded the vehicle, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her father. Colonel Martinez had a habit of checking in during dangerous deployments, even though he was now retired. "Stay safe, sweetheart," the message read. "Remember what I taught you about thinking 3 moves ahead? Sarah smiled grimly as she typed back, "Always do, Dad. Love you." The drive to the conflict zone would take 4 hours through increasingly dangerous territory. Sarah had studied the maps extensively during her 3 years with the organization, memorizing every road, every checkpoint, and every potential hazard. She knew the route that would give her the best chance of reaching her team undetected, using backroads and abandoned settlements that most people avoided. 2 hours into her journey, Sarah encountered her first real test. A checkpoint manned by local militia forces appeared around a bend in the road. These weren't the hostile forces that had trapped her team, but they weren't necessarily friendly either. Sarah's training kicked in as she assessed the situation. 3 armed men looking bored but alert, waving vehicles to a stop for inspection. Sarah slowed the truck and reached for the identification papers she had prepared. As a humanitarian worker, she had legitimate reasons to be in the area, but explaining why she was traveling alone toward an active combat zone would be more challenging. She rolled down the window as one of the militiamen approached, forcing herself to appear calm and confident. "Documents," the man said in heavily accented English, extending his hand. Sarah handed over her identification and organizational credentials, along with a manifest showing medical supplies in the back of the truck. The militiaman studied the papers carefully, then looked at Sarah with suspicion. "You are alone," he observed. "This is not safe for women." "I'm delivering critical medical supplies to our field hospital," Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady. "People will die if these supplies don't arrive." She gestured toward the back of the truck, where boxes of legitimate medical equipment were clearly visible. The militiaman conferred with his colleagues in their local language. Sarah understood enough to know they were debating whether to let her pass or turn her back. She also caught fragments of conversation about the fighting ahead and how dangerous the road had become. After several tense minutes, the man returned to her window. "We cannot guarantee your safety beyond this point," he warned. "Fighting is very bad today. You should turn back." "I understand the risks," Sarah replied, "but I have a job to do." The militiaman looked at her for a long moment, perhaps seeing something in her eyes that convinced him of her determination. He stepped back and waved her through the checkpoint. As Sarah drove away, she could see him shaking his head in the rearview mirror, probably thinking she was either very brave or very foolish. The last 2 hours of the journey took her through increasingly devastated landscape. Abandoned vehicles lined the roads, and the sound of distant explosions grew louder as she approached the area where her team was trapped. Sarah began to hear the chatter of automatic weapons fire, indicating that the fighting was still active around the field hospital. As the sun began to set, Sarah finally reached a position where she could observe the situation. The field hospital sat in a valley surrounded by low hills, with hostile forces positioned on the higher ground. Her team was effectively surrounded, just as Marcus had reported. Sarah studied the terrain through binoculars, identifying potential routes of approach and escape. The tactical situation was even worse than she had imagined, but she had come too far to turn back now. Sarah parked the truck in a concealed position and began to prepare for what would be the most dangerous night of her life. Everything her father had taught her about combat tactics, everything she had learned about emergency medicine, and everything she believed about loyalty and courage was about to be put to the ultimate test. As darkness fell, Sarah transformed herself from a humanitarian worker into something her colleagues had never seen. She methodically applied camouflage paint to her face and hands, techniques her father had drilled into her during countless training exercises. The bulletproof vest fit perfectly under her dark clothing, and the night vision goggles felt familiar, despite the years since she had last used them. Sarah established radio contact with her trapped team, using encrypted frequencies that only authorized personnel knew. When Marcus's voice crackled through her earpiece, the relief in his tone was unmistakable, quickly followed by confusion and anger. "Sarah, what the hell are you doing out here? You need to get back to base immediately. This is not a place for civilians." "I'm here to get you out," Sarah replied calmly, studying the hostile positions through her night vision equipment. "I need a situation report. How many wounded? How much ammunition do you have left?" "Sarah, listen to me very carefully," Marcus continued, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used with new recruits. "You are not trained for this. You need to leave now before you get yourself killed." "Marcus," Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying a steel edge that surprised him. "I am trained for this. Now give me the situation report so I can do my job." There was a long pause before Jennifer's voice came through the radio. "We have 3 wounded civilians who cannot be moved without assistance. 2 have significant blood loss and need immediate medical attention. We're down to less than 100 rounds of ammunition total, and we've counted at least 15 hostiles in the surrounding hills." Sarah absorbed the information while continuing to study the terrain. The field hospital was a concrete building with limited exits, surrounded by open ground that would make any escape attempt extremely dangerous. The hostile forces had positioned themselves to control all the obvious routes. But Sarah noticed something they had missed. "There's a drainage ditch that runs along the east side of the building," she told her team. "It connects to a culvert system that leads to the main road about half a mile away. The hostiles don't have that route covered because they can't see it from their positions." "How do you know about the drainage system?" Marcus asked, suspicion clear in his voice. "I studied the architectural plans for this facility when we first established operations here," Sarah replied. "That ditch can provide concealed movement, but we'll need to create a distraction to draw attention away from the east side." What Sarah didn't tell them was that she had spent hours analyzing those plans specifically for emergency scenarios like this one. Her father had taught her to always have multiple escape routes planned, and Sarah had applied that principle to every location where her organization operated. Sarah spent the next hour moving carefully through the darkness, using every skill her father had taught her about stealth and reconnaissance. She positioned small explosive charges near abandoned vehicles on the west side of the valley, devices she had constructed from materials in her supply kit. These weren't meant to cause casualties, but to create noise and light that would draw the hostile forces' attention away from the real escape route. The most dangerous part of her plan required her to get close enough to the hospital to establish physical contact with her team. The building had a small maintenance entrance on the east side that faced away from most of the hostile positions, but reaching it would require crossing 50 yards of open ground while remaining undetected. Sarah waited until the moon disappeared behind clouds, then began her approach. Every movement was deliberate and controlled, techniques ingrained through years of practice with her father. She moved when the wind stirred the vegetation, froze when gunfire echoed from other parts of the valley, and always stayed low to avoid presenting a silhouette against the skyline. 20 yards from the building, Sarah encountered an unexpected obstacle. A hostile sentry had positioned himself near the drainage ditch, exactly where she needed to access the building. The man was alert and well-armed, smoking a cigarette that glowed in the darkness like a beacon. Sarah realized that her entire plan would fail unless she could neutralize this threat without alerting the other hostile forces. Sarah had never hurt another person in her life, despite all her training. Her father had taught her combat techniques for self-defense in emergency situations, but she had always hoped never to use them. Now crouched in the darkness with her team's lives depending on her actions, Sarah faced the moment that would change her forever. She circled around to approach the sentry from behind, moving with patience that surprised even her. The man was focused on watching the main approaches to the building, never imagining that someone might already be within his perimeter. When Sarah finally struck, it was with clinical precision that her father would have been proud of. The sentry dropped unconsciously without making a sound. Sarah secured the man's weapon and continued toward the building, her heart racing but her hands steady. She had crossed a line that she could never uncross, but her team was depending on her. As she reached the maintenance entrance and prepared to make contact with Marcus and Jennifer, Sarah realized that everything she thought she knew about herself was about to change forever. Sarah tapped softly on the maintenance entrance using a pattern her father had taught her for identifying friendly forces. 3 short taps, pause, 2 long taps, pause, 3 short taps again. The door opened cautiously, and Jennifer's face appeared in the gap, her eyes widening in shock when she saw Sarah crouched outside in full tactical gear. "How did you get past the sentries?" Jennifer whispered, pulling Sarah inside the building. "Training," Sarah replied simply, not wanting to explain about the unconscious guard she had left behind. "Where are the wounded?" Jennifer led her through the darkened corridor to a room where 3 civilians lay on makeshift beds. Marcus was positioned near a window, keeping watch on the hostile forces outside. When he saw Sarah, his expression shifted from relief to amazement to something approaching respect. "Sarah, what you've done is incredible, but we still need to figure out how to get everyone out of here," Marcus said. "The wounded can't walk, and we don't have enough people to carry them all." Sarah knelt beside the first patient, a young doctor who had taken shrapnel to his leg. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she assessed his condition, applying pressure bandages and checking for signs of internal bleeding. The medical training her father had insisted upon was paying off in ways she had never imagined. This one can walk with assistance, she determined, moving to the second patient. This woman needs a stretcher, but her condition is stable. The third one. Sarah examined a nurse who had lost significant blood from an abdominal wound. She needs immediate surgery or she won't make it another hour. We can't perform surgery here, Jennifer protested. We don't have the equipment or the sterile environment. Yes, we do, Sarah replied, opening her medical kit to reveal supplies that made Jennifer's eyes widen. I brought everything we need for emergency field surgery. I can stabilize her enough for transport, but I need 20 minutes of uninterrupted time. Marcus stared at Sarah as if seeing her for the first time. Where did you learn battlefield medicine? My father, Sarah replied, already preparing surgical instruments. He believed everyone should know how to save lives under pressure. She looked up at Marcus with an intensity that surprised him. I need you to set up the distraction in exactly 18 minutes. The explosions I placed will draw their attention west, and that's when we move everyone to the drainage ditch. You placed explosions? Jennifer asked incredulously. When? How? While you were talking, Sarah replied, focusing on the wounded nurse. Marcus, position yourself near the east window. When you see the first explosion, count to 30. Then provide covering fire toward the hills on the north side. That will make them think we're trying to break out that direction. As Sarah worked on the wounded nurse, her hands steady despite the pressure, Marcus and Jennifer watched in amazement. The quiet communications specialist they thought they knew was performing complex medical procedures with the confidence of a seasoned combat medic. Every movement was precise, every decision quick but well considered. Sarah, Marcus said quietly. Who are you, really? Sarah looked up from her patient, her hands covered in blood but her eyes clear and determined. I'm someone who loves her team enough to become whoever they need me to be. The surgery took exactly 19 minutes. Sarah had successfully repaired the major blood vessels and stabilized the patient's condition enough for transport. As she cleaned her instruments, the first explosion echoed across the valley, followed quickly by two more. Through the windows, they could see hostile forces moving toward the west side of the valley, exactly as Sarah had planned. Now, Sarah said, helping to lift the wounded nurse onto an improvised stretcher. Marcus, you and Jennifer carry the stretcher. I'll help the other two patients. We stay low, move quickly, and maintain radio silence until we reach the vehicle. The escape route through the drainage ditch was exactly as Sarah had described. The concrete channel provided cover from observation and allowed them to move the wounded without exposing themselves to hostile fire. Sarah had calculated the timing perfectly. The distraction explosions kept the enemy forces occupied for just long enough for the group to reach the culvert system. Halfway through the drainage system, they encountered another challenge. The culvert was partially collapsed, leaving an opening barely wide enough for one person at a time. Getting the wounded through would require careful coordination and significant risk, as they would be exposed during the transfer. I'll go first and secure the other side, Sarah volunteered, but Marcus caught her arm. Sarah, I need to know something, he said urgently. You've been planning this operation like someone with military training. You perform surgery like a combat medic. You move through hostile territory like a special operations soldier. Who trained you? Sarah looked at her team leader. These people she had worked with for 3 years who were only now seeing who she really was. My father is Colonel James Martinez, retired Special Forces. He spent 15 years training me because he believed the skills might save my life someday. Turns out he was right, but not in the way either of us expected. The revelation hung in the air for a moment before Jennifer spoke. Why didn't you ever tell us? Because you all kept reminding me that I was just a civilian, Sarah replied with a slight smile. I figured you'd find out when it mattered. As they prepared to continue through the collapsed culvert, Marcus realized that everything he thought he knew about leadership and capability had just been challenged by someone they had all underestimated. The woman they had protected was now protecting them, and she was better at it than any of them had imagined possible. Sarah squeezed through the collapsed section of the culvert and emerged on the other side, to find herself face to face with 2 hostile soldiers who had been following their trail. The men were as surprised as she was. but Sarah's training kicked in before they could react. Years of combat drills with her father had prepared her for exactly this kind of close-quarters encounter. The first soldier reached for his weapon, but Sarah was faster. She struck with precision, using techniques designed to incapacitate rather than kill. The man dropped his rifle and stumbled backward, giving Sarah time to deal with his companion. The second soldier was better trained and more alert, managing to get his hands on his weapon before Sarah could stop him. The brief fight that followed would have impressed her father. Sarah used the confined space of the culvert entrance to her advantage, preventing the soldier from bringing his rifle to bear effectively. She disarmed him using a combination of leverage and speed that left both men unconscious but alive. As she secured their weapons, Sarah realized she was breathing hard not from exertion, but from the adrenaline of knowing how close they had all come to disaster. "Clear," she whispered into her radio, then helped guide her teammates and the wounded through the narrow opening. Marcus emerged last, staring at the two unconscious soldiers with a mixture of amazement and respect. "How many people have you had to neutralize tonight?" he asked quietly. "3, Sarah replied, checking the wounded nurse's vital signs. "All still alive. Dad always taught me that taking a life should be the absolute last option." They continued through the drainage system until they reached the point where it connected to the main road. Sarah's vehicle was exactly where she had left it, hidden in a grove of trees that provided concealment from both ground observation and aerial surveillance. The truck's modified suspension and reinforced frame would allow them to traverse rough terrain while keeping the wounded patients as stable as possible. Loading the patients required careful coordination. Sarah had anticipated this challenge and brought specialized medical equipment that could secure stretchers inside the vehicle. The wounded nurse remained unconscious but stable, while the other two patients were alert enough to help position themselves for the journey. As they prepared to leave, Sarah's radio crackled with incoming communications from their base. Regional Command was demanding updates on the situation and expressing growing concern about the missing personnel. Sarah realized that her unauthorized rescue mission would have consequences beyond just saving her team. "Sarah," Marcus said as she prepared to drive, "when we get back, there are going to be a lot of questions about what happened here tonight. Some people aren't going to be happy that you took this kind of initiative." "I know," Sarah replied, starting the engine, "but everyone is alive, and that's what matters." The journey back to base took 3 hours through increasingly familiar territory. Sarah navigated the rough roads with skill that impressed Jennifer, who had driven similar routes dozens of times but never with such smoothness and efficiency. The wounded patients remained stable throughout the trip, thanks to Sarah's medical intervention and the careful planning of their evacuation. They encountered 2 more checkpoints on the return journey, but Sarah's legitimate credentials and the obvious medical emergency of their passengers ensured quick passage. At the second checkpoint, the same militiaman who had warned her about the dangers ahead looked at the truck full of wounded people and nodded with obvious respect. "You found them," he said simply. "This was very brave." "It was necessary," Sarah replied, but she appreciated the acknowledgement from someone who understood the risks she had taken. As they approached their base, Sarah could see emergency vehicles and personnel waiting for their arrival. News of the unauthorized rescue mission had obviously reached command level, and she suspected that her career with the humanitarian organization might be ending tonight. But as she looked in the rearview mirror at her teammates and the wounded civilians she had helped save, Sarah felt no regret about her choices. Marcus reached forward and touched her shoulder. "Sarah, I want you to know that what you did tonight was extraordinary. I've worked with special forces operators who wouldn't have been able to plan and execute this mission as effectively as you did." "I had good training," Sarah replied modestly, "and good motivation." Jennifer leaned forward from the back seat. "We owe you our lives, all of us. I don't know how we're going to explain this to command, but I want you to know that you've earned more respect tonight than most people earn in a lifetime." Sarah smiled as she parked the truck near the medical facility, where the wounded would receive proper treatment. "You don't owe me anything. We're a team. That's what teams do for each other." As medical personnel rushed to transfer the patients to proper facilities, Sarah began to remove her tactical gear. The bulletproof vest, night vision goggles, and combat equipment that had seemed so natural just hours ago now felt foreign again. She was transforming back into the quiet communications specialist that everyone expected her to be. But she knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again. Regional command officers were approaching the vehicle, their expressions serious and their questions undoubtedly challenging. Sarah took a deep breath and prepared to face the consequences of her decision to stop being just a civilian when her team needed her most. Colonel Davidson, the regional command officer, stood waiting as Sarah climbed out of the truck. His expression was unreadable, but Sarah could sense the tension radiating from the group of officials behind him. Marcus and Jennifer flanked her as they approached, presenting a united front that surprised the command staff. "Miss Martinez," Colonel Davidson began formally, "you undertook an unauthorized mission into an active combat zone, violated multiple safety protocols, and put both yourself and this organization at significant risk. I need a full explanation of your actions." Before Sarah could respond, Marcus stepped forward. "Sir, with respect, Miss Martinez saved our lives tonight. She executed a flawless rescue operation under circumstances that would have challenged experienced military personnel." "That's not the point, Thompson," Davidson replied sharply. "She's a civilian contractor with no authorization to conduct military operations. Her actions, regardless of the outcome, represent a serious breach of protocol." Jennifer joined the conversation. "Colonel, I've seen Special Forces operations that weren't planned or executed as effectively as what Sarah accomplished tonight. She demonstrated skills and knowledge that frankly surprised all of us." Sarah listened to her teammates defend her actions, feeling grateful for their support, but knowing she needed to take responsibility for her decisions. "Colonel Davidson," she interrupted, "my teammates are trying to protect me, but the responsibility is entirely mine. I violated protocols because the situation required immediate action, and I was the only person available who could provide it." "You're a communications specialist," Davidson said incredulously. "Where did you acquire the skills to conduct a combat rescue operation?" "My father is Colonel James Martinez, retired Special Forces," Sarah replied. "He trained me extensively in tactical operations, combat medicine, and emergency procedures. I've maintained those skills throughout my career, even though I chose civilian humanitarian work." The revelation caused murmurs among the command staff. Colonel Davidson's expression shifted as he processed the information. "James Martinez? The same James Martinez who led Operation Desert Storm rescue missions?" "Yes, sir," Sarah confirmed. "He insisted I learn these skills for personal protection, but I never expected to use them in a professional capacity." Davidson was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing the implications of Sarah's background against the breach of protocol she had committed. "Miss Martinez, your father has a legendary reputation in military circles. However, that doesn't change the fact that you operated outside your authorization and put this organization in a difficult position." Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the chief medical officer who had been treating the wounded civilians, approached the group. "Colonel, I need to interrupt," she said urgently. "The nurse that Miss Martinez operated on wouldn't have survived another hour without surgical intervention. The field surgery she performed was textbook perfect, and frankly beyond the capability of most of our regular medical staff." Sarah felt a mix of pride and anxiety as the medical assessment was delivered. She had known the surgery was successful, but having it validated by a senior physician meant everything to her. Additionally, Dr. Warren continued, the way she managed the transport of all 3 patients prevented additional complications that could have been fatal. Her medical training is clearly extensive and highly practical. Colonel Davidson looked from Sarah to her teammates to the medical officer, clearly struggling with a decision that would affect multiple careers. "Miss Martinez, your unauthorized actions tonight saved lives, demonstrated exceptional skill, and achieved an outcome that our military assets couldn't accomplish. However, they also violated fundamental protocols and created potential legal complications for this organization." Sarah stood straighter, preparing for whatever consequences would follow. "I understand, sir. I'm prepared to accept responsibility for my actions." "What you're prepared to accept," Davidson replied, "and what this organization needs are 2 different things." He paused, looking at the reports being handed to him by his staff. "The wounded civilians are stable and will make full recoveries. Your team suffered no casualties. The hostile forces in the area have withdrawn, apparently believing they were facing a much larger military operation than actually occurred." Marcus spoke up again. "Sir, Sarah's actions tonight demonstrated capabilities that could be invaluable to our future operations. Rather than viewing this as a disciplinary issue, Perhaps we should consider how to better utilize her skills. Thompson, are you suggesting we promote a communications specialist to field operations based on one unauthorized mission? Davidson asked. I'm suggesting we recognize that we've been underutilizing a valuable asset, Marcus replied firmly. Sarah proved tonight that she can handle situations that challenge our most experienced personnel. Jennifer nodded in agreement. Colonel, the intelligence she gathered, the tactical planning she implemented, and the medical skills she demonstrated represent exactly the kind of multidisciplinary expertise we need for complex humanitarian operations. Sarah watched the conversation unfold around her, realizing that her teammates weren't just defending her actions. They were advocating for a fundamental change in how the organization viewed her role. The quiet communications specialist who had been dismissed as just a civilian was being proposed for positions that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. Colonel Davidson studied Sarah carefully, as if seeing her for the first time. Miss Martinez, your father's reputation preceded you, but tonight you've established your own. However, this organization can't simply ignore protocol violations regardless of the positive outcomes. Sarah felt her stomach drop, anticipating termination or serious disciplinary action. But Davidson's next words surprised everyone present. Effective immediately, you're being transferred to our Special Operations Coordination Unit. Your new position will be Senior Field Operations Specialist, with full authorization to plan and execute emergency rescue missions. Your salary will be adjusted accordingly, and you'll receive additional tactical training to complement the skills you already possess. The silence that followed was broken by Marcus's quiet chuckle. Sir, did you just promote her for breaking the rules? Thompson, I promoted her for saving lives under impossible circumstances, Davidson replied. The rule breaking was just the delivery method. 6 months later, Sarah Martinez stood in a briefing room addressing a group of new recruits. Her promotion to Senior Field Operations Specialist had transformed not only her career, but the entire approach her organization took toward emergency rescue operations. The quiet communications specialist had become one of their most requested field operatives, leading successful missions in some of the world's most dangerous locations. The young recruits listened intently as Sarah explained tactical planning principles, her voice carrying the authority that came from proven experience. Among them sat several former military personnel who had initially been skeptical about learning from someone they assumed was just another civilian administrator. That skepticism had evaporated quickly once they learned about the mission that had changed everything. Remember, Sarah told the group, the most important skill in any emergency situation is the ability to adapt. Plans fail, equipment breaks, and people don't always behave as expected. Your training gives you the foundation, but your judgment and creativity will determine whether you succeed. After the session, Sarah walked to her office, which now overlooked the operations center where she had once sat, listening helplessly to her trapped teammates. The walls displayed commendations from 3 different governments, testimonials from rescued civilians, and a photograph of her with her father during her official military cross-training program. Colonel Martinez had visited the base shortly after Sarah's promotion, officially proud but privately amazed at how his daughter had applied the skills he had taught her. I trained you to protect yourself, he had told her. I never imagined you'd use those skills to protect so many others. Marcus knocked on her doorframe, carrying a mission briefing folder. Their working relationship had evolved into something deeper than professional respect. He had become one of her closest confidants, and she valued his operational expertise almost as much as his friendship. We have a situation developing in the eastern sector, he reported. 3 aid workers are trapped by flash flooding, and local emergency services can't reach them. Command wants to know if you think it's viable for a rescue operation. Sarah reviewed the briefing materials, her mind automatically analyzing the tactical challenges and potential solutions. The geographical layout reminded her of training scenarios her father had designed, but the human stakes made every decision critically important. It's challenging but doable, she determined. We'll need specialized equipment for water rescue, but the terrain allows for multiple approach routes. How long do we have? 6 hours before the situation becomes critical, Marcus replied. The team is ready to deploy on your authorization. Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied high-stakes missions, but now it was tempered by experience and confidence. She was no longer the uncertain communications specialist who had improvised a desperate rescue. She had become someone who could assess complex situations quickly and make decisions that saved lives. Authorize the mission, she decided. I'll lead the team personally. As Marcus left to coordinate the deployment, Sarah gathered her gear with practiced efficiency. The tactical equipment that had once felt foreign was now as familiar as the communication devices she had used in her previous role. She had successfully integrated her two identities, the careful planner and the decisive field operative. Jennifer appeared in her doorway, wearing the smile that had become common among team members who had witnessed Sarah's transformation. Another rescue mission? You know, there was a time when we thought you were too delicate for field work. There was a time when I thought so too, Sarah replied, checking her equipment one final time. Turns out we were all wrong about what I was capable of. As Sarah prepared to leave for another dangerous mission, she reflected on the night that had changed everything. The woman who had been dismissed as just a civilian had discovered that courage and capability couldn't be measured by job titles or official credentials. She had learned that sometimes the most important qualifications were determination, loyalty, and the willingness to become whoever your team needed you to be. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now supervised some of the same people who had once excluded her from operational briefings. But there was no resentment in her success, only gratitude for the opportunity to use her skills in service of something larger than herself. Sarah Martinez walked toward the helicopter that would take her to another emergency, another chance to save lives, another opportunity to prove that heroism could come from the most unexpected places. The quiet communications specialist was gone forever, replaced by someone who had always been there waiting for the right moment to emerge. Her radio crackled with updates from the field as she climbed aboard the aircraft. 3 people were counting on her team to reach them before it was too late. Sarah smiled as she put on her headset, remembering a conversation with her father after her first official commendation. "Dad, do you think you trained me for this?" she had asked. "Sweetheart," Colonel Martinez had replied, "I trained you to survive. Everything else you accomplished on your own." As the helicopter lifted off toward another dangerous mission, Sarah knew her father was right. The skills he had taught her had kept her alive, but the courage to use them in service of others had come from somewhere deeper, from the understanding that being just a civilian, or just anything, was only a limitation if you chose to accept it. The rescue ahead would be challenging, but Sarah Martinez was no longer someone who accepted limitations. She was someone who redefined them,